Okay, so today we're going to talk about BMT 11. Now, this is HL only, okay? It is Hofstede's cultural dimensions, okay? This links to topic 2.5 of organizational culture, which is once again HL only. So, what is Hofstede's cultural dimensions, okay? Basically, it is a BMT situational tool, okay, that's used to understand the various cultures within an organization, okay? So you would use Hofstede's cultural dimensions as a manager or someone to understand what cultures are in your organization, and not just an organization, but it can also be to understand of a basic country and of a region of your particular target customers in a region. So, why do we use Hofstede's cultural dimension? Why is it good? Well, firstly, understanding the cultures and basically corporate culture of your employees and their national culture helps managers recognize their behaviors and what they will do well, what they won't do well, and how to motivate them, okay? Because some people are cultures are very different, okay? So if you motivate them into a way where you're giving them so much freedom, but maybe you're in a culture that doesn't like freedom and wants delegation, that's not going to be that useful. So you need to understand corporate culture in order to recognize your behaviors of your employees and how to motivate them. Secondly, it helps organizations adapt to cultures when it comes to their business practices, because they may seem unethical if they don't adapt to cultures. They may seem insensitive and that stuff. Third, marketing specifically, it helps market specifically and strategize marketing strategies specifically tailored to your customer's culture. If I can see with the Hofstede's cultural dimensions, BMT, that maybe my culture is very collectivist, okay, then I would incentivize more marketing strategies that are related towards groups. So let's actually cover HCD in a second, okay? We'll get to that in a minute. But the cultural dimensions that Hofstede actually proclaims there are these six, okay? It is kind of the idea where almost everything is on a scale, okay? So we have this idea of power distance. You can be very power or a lot less power. And then that is the first cultural dimension. Once again, I will get into all this later. Let me just introduce it. Secondly, we have this idea of collectivism versus individualism, these complete contrasts that are end opposite sides of a scale. Then we have femininity versus masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term versus short-term orientation, and then indulgence versus restraint, okay? And a key term to recognize when we look at Hofstede's cultural dimensions is what we call cultural norms, okay? This is basically the shared experiences, values, and beliefs that kind of guide the behaviors of people within that organization. So, recap, it is useful for managers to recognize cultures, which is useful in a variety of ways. Recognizing these cultural norms within your business is essential, and it can be demonstrated through these six dimensions. Okay, so now we can get into the actual cultural dimensions, okay? And when I talk about cultural dimensions, Hofstede basically gives countries and areas a score based off their cultural dimension on each different dimension, alright? So, let's look at these three first. Power distance, okay? Power distance is just the extent to which there is a clear respect towards authority, okay? And is this extent to which our culture accepts and respects this idea of authority and status, okay? So it's obviously, as I said, it's like a scale. So it goes from high and low on the other sides, okay? This high sense of power, the high degree of power distance exists in organizations, okay, with centralized decision making, okay, and hierarchical structures, because that's where power is. Power goes from here to here to here to ultimately here. And these decision making is very centralized because usually a group of individuals or a small group of individuals hold power and decision making power in businesses. So an example of this could be like the army, okay, where those organizations accept these power differences and thus decision making is centralized. So additionally, this an example of this can be Japan, because Japan's strong power difference isn't due to like authority, rather than this sense of respect to the people in charge or seniors and elders, okay? And that's an example of how power distance can be used away from business but into a regional area as well. So if you're a manager and you're disrespecting the elderly in Japan, then that's highly against their high power distance culture, okay? So now once we talk about a low power distance, okay, essentially these are kind of the opposite because they're on the other side of the scale. These are decentralized decision making organizations, as because power is spread out between a large groups of people, which means that individuals share power, share decision making, and thus leads to this flatter structures because people have the same power, same levels of hierarchy, okay? And within this low power distance, low degrees of power distance organizations and areas and regions, this sense of delegation and job empowerment is greatly used because people feel empowered in their job to do the work rather than doing stuff and just listening to the authorities, okay? So this does lead to, as I said, a flatter structure, okay? And in these cultures, senior managers are expected to work harder. So this does not mean that workers have to work longer hours than their bosses on like a power distance. So these can be areas like Denmark, UK, Austria. These are all areas with low power distance, okay, where there's a lot of more equal distribution of power, and therefore a demand justification of all this power distribution. Now let's move on to this idea of collectivism versus individualism, okay? Once again, we can see how these are on opposing sides of the scales because they are contradictory themselves. Basically, this dimension measures the degree to which people are integrated into groups in society, okay? It's whether or not a society values individual over a team or collective group of individuals, all right? This is sometimes also referred to the I versus we culture dimension, okay? So let's talk about collectivism. So collectivism is essentially the importance of the group and social cooperation are over the needs of the individuals within the group. However, individualism is the idea of the needs of the individuals are greater than the needs of the group as a whole, okay? So within these collectivist groups, support, protection, and loyalty are heavily valued within this business, as everyone's in a group reliant and dependent on other people because they work together. However, this sense of freedom and autonomy is greatly valued in individualistic cultures because people want their freedom to whatever and they want autonomy over their own action, okay? This basically shows how like within individual cultures, the self or like yourself as a person in the culture, you are defined by your own individual achievements, okay? This sense of the needs of yourself, it makes it so that you're defined by the needs of your own individual achievement. However, within a collectivist culture, you are defined by your group membership or acceptance within a group and how that group succeeds, okay? So that basically shows how this idea of self-reliance, okay, is... Sorry, I had these mixed up, but self-reliance is basically the norm in individualism, okay? And within collectivism, the idea is of shared responsibility. Because, once again, people are dependent on themselves. You are seen to work on yourself and not rely on others as the norm. As I was talking about cultural norms before, in individualism, whereas you are interdependent within your group, and that is the norm over there. So places like the US, UK, Australia are places that have high individualism, okay? So these like Western countries. However, places like Taiwan, Venezuela, and like Portugal are considered to be more collectivist societies. And that is how they've been rated. So now let's move on to masculinity versus femininity, okay? Now, this is kind of in the name, okay? It is this sense of the focusing on the stereotypical male and female traits and how these roles play in communities, okay? In Hoffstede's model, a masculine community exists when how a masculine society is defined by this sense of a focus on achievement, power, cooperation, success. However, this feminist or this femininity society is defined by this focus on cooperation, relations with others, modesty, and this overall quality of life, okay? This basically results in this kind of motto that masculinity follows as a live to work. This essentially means you have to work, whereas the femininity culture has this opposing idea of you work to live, that you want to work to assert your life. However, in a masculine culture, you live to work, that you have to work. This makes it so that this sense of ego and heroism and competitiveness is so prominent in a stereotypical masculinity culture. However, within a femininity culture, this sense of cooperation, negotiation, modesty are the aspects that thrive within individuals. So basically, this kind of also alludes to the fact that in a more masculinity culture, people strive for more material rewards, this sense of pride to fuel their ego, okay? However, this sense of modesty is what femininity cultures strive for. So we can basically understand that areas like New Zealand and maybe Denmark, Norway have quite femininity cultures. However, masculinity cultures are very high in areas like Japan, Venezuela, and some European countries like maybe Switzerland and Hungary. So yeah, these are the first three. Power distance is the extent to which there's a clear respect towards authority. Collectivism versus individualism is the degree to which people are integrated in groups. Masculinity versus femininity is kind of other way described as the degree to the which motivation is towards achievement and success rather than cooperation and modesty. Those are these three. Okay, so now these are the remaining three cultural dimensions of Hoffstedes. We have the uncertainty avoidance, the long versus short-term orientation, and this idea of indulgence versus restraint. So first, when we talk about the uncertainty avoidance, this is the dimension that's basically an index or a measure for a society's tolerance towards ambiguity, uncertainty, okay, or this, if they're comfortable, they're generally comfortable with this idea of uncertainty and ambiguity, okay, or vagueness, okay. So obviously we have this sense of high versus low as opposing on the scale, and it's high uncertainty avoidance are individuals that have a rigid codes of beliefs and behaviors, and in so they tend to be intolerant, okay, of ambiguity. Thus, as I wrote here, they are intolerant to what we call unorthodox behavior. So this is stuff that's not traditional and that is like conventional abstract behavior that you don't usually do. So they are very against it because they are not so tolerant about this sense of uncertainty. So they strict by their own rigid codes, beliefs, behaviors in order to follow this orthodox behavior, the traditional behavior what always occurs. However, a low uncertainty avoidance, this low degree of uncertainty avoidance is a lot less strict rules, okay, and has such a greater openness for change, okay, and it's like a culture of an openness of change. And basically, within a high uncertainty avoidance, there is a very low tolerance to risk taking, as because they are very rigid in nature. This low tolerance to risk taking is because they're not tolerant to this idea of uncertainty, okay? Thus, this forces them to become very structured, very traditional, and have lots of control, or as much control over the uncertainty as possible, okay? However, within a low uncertainty avoidance, there's a high tolerance towards risk taking, okay? So people are very open to taking risks, and honestly, they're kind of praised for it, okay? And it is a lot much a relaxed attitude towards change, and within this low uncertainty avoidance, titles don't have this as such of an important role as these rigid and traditional structures here, because it's more that any individual capable of dealing with a task is respected, rather than this idea of, no, the CEO has to deal with this idea of structureness. So basically, countries that have a high degree of structure, uncertainty, avoidance, is maybe areas like France. France is a big one. Russia, Belgium, South Korea. However, the countries with these low degrees of uncertainty avoidance can be areas like China, Denmark, Vietnam, Sweden, where they're open to change a lot. So now we have what we call long-term versus short-term orientation, okay? This is the idea that the cultural dimension that basically connects the past with attitudes of the future, and basically links how people like deal with the challenges of the present as well as the future, okay? So there are two approaches that Hoffstedes understand, which is a short-term and a long-term. The short-term orientation is this idea of being a lot more present at now orientated, okay? And they have a low index for long-term versus short-term. However, this long-term orientation is a lot more fixated on a future-oriented perspective, okay? And they have a much more focus on the future. Within the short orientation, traditions and cultures are kept because they don't want to be changed for the long term, and they want to abide by what they have stand by now. However, in a long term, they are a lot more willing to adapt and maybe transform their traditions and cultures to benefit them in the future, okay? So, as I said, these short terms they follow this idea of pragmatism, okay? And that's basically this idea of efficiency and practicality, okay? Where everything should be done to be efficient now and just be as practical as possible now. However, in the long orientation, we have this idea of patience and perseverance that's more dominant. People are more, they do not prioritize short-term successes. So this society relies on their patience and their perseverance to achieve their long-term growth. And in order to do this, short-term orientated businesses, they prefer short-term profits over sustainability. They prefer this idea of being alive day-to-day, performing action day-to-day, and being alive in the short term. However, the long-term oriented business wants to retain and sustain their positions in the future. They want to be sustainable rather than prioritize short-term profits. They want this sense of prosperity in the future. So, according to Hoffstedes, this idea of high long-term orientation scores are typically found within East Asia, China, Japan, okay? However, more moderate to low countries, okay, are like Angola, Iceland, Australia. So, and these places are basically examples of we're focused on short term or we're focusing on the future. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. So, I'm gonna try to explain this to my best efforts, but the last and sixth dimension is the idea of an indulgence versus restraint, okay? When I talk about an indulgent culture, this is a society or an organization that fosters the natural human drive to be free, to have fun and enjoy life. However, a restraint culture is this tendency for a society to suppress people's personal needs, their personal desires, in order to by a set of system of strict and societal norms and self-regulation, okay? So this is basically indulgence is prioritizes this idea of having fun, this idea of leisure, okay, and how and then society encourages leisure, enjoyment, and this pursuit of personal gratification. However, this restraint culture is more about this idea of self-discipline, sort of following these societal norms and suppressing your desires. Now, a key mistake that happens is a common mistake is confusing this idea of indulgence and restraint with individualism and collectivism, okay? But individualism and collectivism is more about being by yourself and working in a group harmony with other individuals. However, this idea of indulgence and restraint is the idea to set yourself free and have own fun regardless of the work you do, and compared to this sense of work and follow by the rules and just abide and suppress your own desires and suppressions. So those are the 6 cultural dimensions of Hoffstedes. Uncertainty avoidance is an index where societies tolerate ambiguity or uncertainty. This long-term versus short-term orientation is how cultures differ between thinking short-term and long-term. And this idea of indulgence versus restraint is the idea of fulfilling your desires or suppressing them. So yeah, those are the 6 cultural dimensions. Okay, so to end off Hoffstede's cultural dimensions, I'm just going to explain a general analysis and evaluation of this. So, the advantages of Hoffstede's cultural dimensions. Firstly, it is a very coherent tool, okay, for classifying and discussing cultures, as managers can clearly see scores, data, and ranges of how to classify cultures within their own organization. Secondly, it helps explain a range of social behaviors because you can understand now why people act certain ways and change your actions towards that. And third, it can prevent or minimize these cultural clashes within your business and presents itself to managers as a tool to try to solve these issues and basically generate more productivity and efficiency as a more coherent culture. However, the data that Hoffstede has taken all from was only from a tech industry, the IBM company, okay? So this kind of makes his results kind of ungeneralizable. So we may not be able to apply, it may not be fully accurate to every other business in the world. Secondly, the world changes a lot. So this sense of these 6 cultural dimensions, like for an example, the masculinity versus femininity, yes, the content did not change and the evaluation did not change, but we'd have to transform the name, okay, to something else because of a changing world. So that could also present an issue, as maybe cultures in the future can also change, where an individualistic culture just might not appear anymore, or cultures are naturally beginning to blend because of everyone beginning to work together in more multinational, multi-cooperational society. And third, realistically, there is no universal way to cater to all cultures. As a manager, You can have one individualist, one collectivist, one masculinity, one femininity, one indulgent, one restraint. You cannot cater to every single person at all, and doing so will just be too redundant and too much of a waste of time. So it is very great in analyzing and classifying what your cultures are. However, it may just lead you with a lot of information where, unless you're a very skilled manager, you won't really know what to do with it. So, that's all of Hofstede's cultural dimensions.